A little bonus here for you. Say no more, Eugenia Herbert, garden imperialism. Well, Flora's empire. Eugenia, tell me about your journey. Let's start there.
Okay. First of all, how is the mic? Is it too loud, too soft? Sorry?
You'll have to speak up a bit, I think.
Have to speak up a bit? Okay. Right, yes. Well, Charles was wondering a bit where this book came from. And it does have a curious, sorry? Oh, okay. Is this better? Yeah, okay. I'm a historian of Africa, not initially of India. And my most recent book on African history was Twilight on the Zambezi, and it was an attempt to recreate everyday life in a British colony in Central Africa, a very remote post, late in the colonial period, in the late 1950s, not long before independence. And I had the good fortune to encounter a retired officer who steered me to all sorts of other retired officers, and then I added the testimonies from them to, is it working, right? To district reports, memoirs, letters, that sort of thing. And when, in the course of that, two things jumped out at me that surprised me a little. One was the importance of Worcestershire sauce. Let's see if we can get these things working. And the other was the importance of gardens. Now, Worcestershire sauce's use was pretty obvious. It would make almost anything palatable, especially if it was spiked with a goodly amount of gin. The gardens, I thought, were pretty obvious too, that it was just a question of nostalgia. People far from home wanting a touch, if they could possibly make a lawn grow or the gardens grow. And this is the site that I was focusing on, Kalabo in the Upper Zambezi. And so then serendipitously, the opportunity came to come to India. And I thought, well, let's see what's going on with gardens there. After all, the British were in India for a much longer time and in much greater numbers. So I thought this would probably be variations on the theme of nostalgia, but we'll see. And in fact, it turned into a good deal more interesting and more complex subject than I would have imagined. But first, this is the American edition of the book. Notice the emphasis on empire. And then this is the Indian version where the emphasis on Flora. And I love the kind of twinning of that. Now, what I thought I would do, Charles, I'll grab that, is read the preface so you get a little idea about what the book is like and what I was trying to do. And I'll see how this projects. The novelist Penelope Lively devotes an entire chapter of her autobiography to her grandmother's garden over several generations, with their lawns, informal walks, lily ponds, snowdrops, bluebells, and roses. They are virtual palimpsests of English garden history, as it is most familiar to us. Essence of Englishness, you would think. Maybe I better lower this a little. The English garden. But in fact, as Lively points out, there is hardly anything in these gardens except the yew trees and primroses that is native to the British Isles. The garden is rather a cacophony, filled with plants from all over the world. And when her family moved to Egypt, her mother created a garden there that was unabashedly English in design, even if many of the shrubs and trees were perforce adapted to a warmer climate. A walk through Kew Gardens, yes. Wait a second. Yeah.
There we go.
Right, that's right. A walk through Kew Gardens reinforces this experience of gardens as a global reference system. On a May morning, Rhododendron Dell, is ablaze with the blossoms of these glorious shrubs. But while the dell was laid out by Capability Brown, giant of 18th century English natural landscape design, it had to wait until the next century for the rhododendrons that Joseph Dalton Hooker brought back from the Sikkim Himalayas. And then this is,
There we go. Yes, Clan.
this is working marvelously well. This is Cragside, simply covered in Northumberland, simply covered with it. And the English countryside, it's hard to imagine now without the rhododendrons. A few years ago, I had taken a similar stroll through Hyder Ali's Lal Bagh in Bangalore. Just inside the main gate, I was surprised to come upon a colony of plaster gnomes, statues, and other assorted paraphernalia in a garden initially inspired by Mughal prototypes and later redesigned to accommodate English flowers and flower beds and walkways. At the far end, I came to the Glass House, a miniature crystal palace with the annual Republic Day flower show, it is today, in full swing. Around the periphery of the Lal Bagh, nurseries clustered, meeting the needs not only of the locals, but also of patrons from all over India. It has often been said that the English are a nation of gardeners with a passion for plants and flowers surpassing that of all other people. Our England is a garden, wrote Rudyard Kipling. They're also a nation of empire builders with Kipling in the forefront. Wherever they went, they took with them as part of their cultural baggage their love of gardens and their certainties about what a garden should look like. Nowhere was this more evident than in India. It was one thing to show off tropical exotics in English conservatories, or even coax them to grow outside for a season. Quite another matter to live in the midst of these exotics in all their terrifying luxuriance. The farther from home one ventured, the more one longed for familiar cowslips and hollyhocks and Michaelmas daisies, for well-trimmed lawns and neat flower beds. Much has been written about architecture and imperialism, little about gardens and imperialism. Perhaps because gardens are far more ephemeral and harder to document, perhaps because they seem less serious. And yet, two decades ago, the garden historian Charles Quest Ritson pointed out that the history of the gardens of the Raj remained to be written. And Flora's empire is an attempt to do that, especially through the voices of individuals, whether high or low, and often their wives, who were among the most prolific writers. Other imperial powers imposed their gardens on the subject lands as well, but it was the British who came to paint most of the world red and whose gardens had the most profound effect. In the end, they left a lasting horticultural mark on India, just as India did on them. Now, the book covers a whole lot of topics: botanical gardens, the recreation of New Delhi, the hill stations, and simply domestic gardens and the posher gardens of the governors and the governor generals. But what I want to focus on for this talk, because it's more manageable, I'll just show one other botanical garden, the herbal garden that still exists in Darjeeling, because there was a great interest in Indian herbals, especially early on, not just commercial crops. Now, what I want to do is focus on the Taj Mahal, the history of the British at the Taj Mahal. And there's a good reason for this. It brings out the importance of the pre-British history, the Mughal history of India. Now, the Mughals could match the British garden for garden, no doubt about that. And one has a feeling that the British were always kind of looking over their shoulders with, well, here we are in a Mughal palace right here, or of sorts. The Mughals conquered India in 1526 under Babur. and the dynasty declined more or less after 1707. So I want to show you one of the first, the gardens. Here's the Taj Mahal as it is now. And then the Mughal gardens. Now this is not photographically realistic, but these are two images of Babur, the conqueror of India, the first Mughal ruler, that was laid out in Kabul in Afghanistan. When Babur came to India, he was appalled. It was dusty and hot and disorderly, and the gardens were not fit to be seen. So he set about creating gardens, and it's important to note that he didn't build forts or palaces. He built gardens, created gardens everywhere. And the Mughal garden really took its beginning from him, and then it was expanded under future rulers, almost all of whom took a great interest in gardens, even when they started adding, palaces and tombs and forts to them. Now let me just read a passage about what a Mughal garden would have looked like, because this becomes important when we get into restorations. Okay. Mughal gardens in India were always walled. The basic plan was that of the Persian Sharbagh, or quadripartite garden, that is the 4 parts. These were strictly geometric, laid out on a grid, divided literally into 4 parts or multiples of 4. In the case of the Taj, there are 4 main squares, each subdivided into 4, so there's 16. Water channels ran at right angles, marking off the main divisions and meeting in a large tank in the center. Symbolically, the layout invokes the Garden of Paradise, as described in the Quran, with its intersecting rivers, the 4 rivers of paradise. Water is paramount in the design of the Taj, as in all Mughal gardens, with lotus blossom-shaped fountains playing the length of the main canal. In the Taj garden, a large stone platform, the chabutra, rises at the confluence of the canals, around which runs the water channel. There are also chabutras on the east and west sides of the garden. Such raised platforms and pavilions were the social center of the Mughal garden. Here a ruler could entertain his guests, refreshed by the cool spray of the fountains and inhaling the perfumes of the garden. Scenes of pavilions spread with carpets were a beloved staple of Mughal miniature painters. They display an antiphony of art and nature. Rugs depicted gardens, gardens invited rugs, and miniatures depicted both rugs and gardens. Now the main walks of the Mughal garden, and this is an important thing to remember, were lined with trees, especially alternating cypresses and fruit trees, symbolizing life, death, and rebirth. And the walks were always raised well above the gardens and above the channels of water as well. The parterres that were formed by the intersections of the garden were planted with turf, flowers, and often a flowering tree at the corner. Looking down on the blossoms from above was like looking down on a floral carpet. Writing some 20 or more years after the garden was completed, the Garden of the Taj, François Bernier, the French physician who attended Aurangzeb, describes the main walk of the Taj as about 8 French feet, or about 2.5 meters or 8.2 English feet above the garden, and so wide as to admit 6 coaches abreast. Now, surely both cases are an exaggeration, but you get the sense that it was wide walkway down the middle and that the walkways were raised significantly above the parterres. On either, it runs on either side of the canal, ornamented with fountains placed at certain intervals. To the left and right were further pathways covered with trees and many parterres full of flowers. The East India Company agent, Peter Mundy, visiting the gardens of Agra even earlier, notes that they are square and then again divided into other lesser squares and that into other like beds and plots. In some little groves of trees, as apple trees, orange trees, mulberry trees, mango trees, plantains, these latter in ranks, as are the cypresses. And in the flowers would be roses, marigolds, poppies, carnations, and so forth. A crucial thing to remember is that the Mughal garden was a visual delight, but it also was intended to appeal to all the senses. There would be the fragrance of the fruit trees and the fragrance of various bushes, shrubs, and also the sound of songbirds, so that there was simply a blending of all these sensory experiences. Now, are we going to time? I think I better, right.
Why do you don't have time to talk about the English garden, as it were?
Yeah, okay. So Shah Jahan created, let's have the next one. Shah Jahan represents the apogee of Mughal rule, and he created the gardens and the tomb of the Taj Mahal when his wife died suddenly and giving birth to her 14th child. Now, he would have designed the garden pretty much this way, but the thing he added, and let's have the next one, is you can see that the flowers come inside. There are flowers on the left there, or is that your right, in manuscripts, and then the inlays. I'm sure you've seen the Pietra Dura inlays on the Taj, and then the next one, the dados in the marble of the Taj Mahal. So garden and architecture and garden blend there in a single one. Now, we'll go quickly over the next two because Shah Jahan was imprisoned by his son and left to look across the Taj Mahal. Now, let's get to the Europeans and their experience of the Taj. Europeans began visiting and writing about the Taj and painting it from the late 18th century on. And we have a whole succession. I'll just show you of these, beginning with Hodge, William Hodge, and then the Danielle's nephew and uncle, and then Charlotte Canning. And Charles has written a wonderful book about Charlotte Canning, so I recommend that to you. Okay, so you can see that in the court, Edward Lear and Mary Ann North, the botanical fading. Now, you can see that what happened was that the Taj, like all gardens, was getting more and more overgrown or simply more luxuriant, depending on your point of view. But nobody seemed to mind. In fact, many people said the experience had a kind of mystery and suspense to it because you couldn't see everything head on. You had to come in and work your way, and then gradually the image of the Taj would unfold, and there it was. So that was the situation when Lord Curzon became Viceroy in 1899 and was Viceroy till 1905. The picture, let's see, would it be left or right with you? You can see the dense one, which would have been taken from the entrance building at the Taj Mahal, is from Curzon's own collection. This is the way he would have seen the Taj in 1885 on his first visit, where he kept a diary, and for 16 pages he goes on rhapsodizing about the Taj and about the garden and saying there's nothing more beautiful in the world. So Curzon becomes Viceroy and had a monumental program that was aimed at the restoration of India's historical monuments. But the centerpiece was the Taj. And you can see the contrasting picture. This is when Curzon gets through with it. And you can see he's cleared almost everything in the center. And there are trees on the side. but it's a very open, unobstructed view of the Taj. This is pretty much the way it is now. Curzon entrusted this to the Archaeological Survey of India, but it was pretty much hands-on. He was telling them what to do and telling them, fix this and fix that. But essentially, it has stayed about the same. The next one, to show what he was going on, there's a plan by Hodgson, 1828, and it clearly showed those 16 divisions. And then the aerial view now, on the other side, I'm never quite sure which sides these are for you looking at it. So you can see that he had Bernier's accounts, various others. So it was a deliberate attempt to create the garden that he thought should be there, not necessarily the one that was there once upon a time. And the point that I want to make is that Curzon's legacy it continues to this day. Now we're talking about over 100 years ago, but we'll run through a couple of monuments, and this has really struck me, how the landscaping is so formulaic. It follows virtually the same plan. Oh, I wanted to also say that the first thing that Curzon did was to clear out that ugly, dusty, dirty area right outside that Jolokana where you approach the Taj from the south. And he thought it was disgusting. Well, in fact, it was a whole city that Shah Jahan had created. There was the tomb, but then there was Mumtazabad. And this was supposed to be a center of economic activity with merchants, caravans, right, and all that. But he found it disgusting, and he cleared it. And this is pretty much the way it is now, with variations a little bit from time to time. And this is the way I figure it would have looked. It would have been 17th century counterpart of an English street, of an Indian street, something like this. Okay, now this is the Taj now, and you can see the lawns, and you can see that the walkways are barely raised, and there are the strip gardens, but mostly it's pretty clear. Right, and this is the view from the mausoleum itself toward that entrance Jolokana. And the whole question is why Curzon wanted to clear it so much, and we don't know quite why, but I have my suspicions. Curzon's own park, Kettleston Park in Derbyshire, looks as if it had just been frozen in time from the 18th century. It's a capability brown construction of a natural environment that's entirely artificial. But what Curzon skipped over was the entire garden history of the 19th century. My own view is that Curzon was determined to keep the focus on the architecture, to control the vision of anybody coming in, to have them see what he wanted them to see. But of course, it was frozen in time. There was not much provision for change or alteration. And it's this legacy, I think, that persists with the other monuments down to this day, and I will run through a few of those. Khajuraho, which many of you may know, you see the gravel walk, the low hedge, the lawn, maybe a bougainvillea, but otherwise it's very much the template from the Taj Mahal. And this is a temple complex in Bhubaneswar and Orissa, pretty much the same kind of style. I'll run through these quickly because I think you get the point. Now, the garden that has recently been excavated across from the Taj Mahal, the Matabag, the Moonlight Garden, we realized since the excavation of Elizabeth Moynihan in the early 1890s was intended to be the mirror image of the Taj garden. That is, the Taj, instead of being at the end of the garden, which is unusual for Mughal tombs, was in fact in the middle. Then there's the river. Then there was this garden opposite, which has almost exactly the same dimensions as the Taj garden. The trouble was the grounds were very unstable and it had to be abandoned very quickly. It was flooding and subsiding and all that. And there are still the remnants of a couple of towers, but mostly villagers have carried off the stones. But there is this vague attempt to restore it, which I find worse than nothing, but that's my own prejudice there. So you simply don't get the effect. Shah Jahan and his courtiers, the purpose was they would come across the river, especially on moonlight nights, the full night. They would sit on a raised platform and they'd have a view of the Taj Mahal, and the surrounding gardens there with them would have reminded them of all that. So then there's the Victoria Memorial, which was Curzon's monument to himself as much as to Queen Victoria. And it's got the Curzon lawn and the Edward lawn, and then Queen Victoria at Curzon's own statue. But very much another English garden with the gravel walkways and the pool, but on the English model. The Imperial Hotel, which you may know, and you notice that a lot of Indian hotels now advertise that they have English gardens. Finally, the last one I want to show, to my surprise, is the Akshardham Mosque, or temple, sorry, which is very recent, and yet it still follows this pattern. So the question is why? Why this persistence of the Curzon model? And it's important to contrast the English gardens in the 19th century from those earlier, the garden houses. And I see them almost, in many cases, there are lots of exceptions, as the horticultural counterpart of Macaulay's 1835 Minute on Education, where he said that the best thing that could be done was to abolish the teaching of Sanskrit, the teaching of the classics of English literature, and get people going on English and Milton and Shakespeare, and then they'd be civilized. Now, that's an oversimplification, and there are many, many exceptions to the rule. That is, people like Charlotte Canning, who loved the gardens in India, the non-British gardens, for what they were, and didn't try to turn them into English gardens. But I think on the whole, the message is this is part of the civilizing mission, and that's why I titled this Garden Imperialism, because it's counterpart to the other aspects of imperial activities in India and around the world. Let's stop there so we have time for questions. Charles.
I mean, thanks very much. Thank you very much, Eugenia. I'm afraid on these arguments it's very difficult to hear. Not the best environment, particularly in the Durbar Hall. I wonder whether we couldn't open it up at this point and just look at the whole issue of what the concept of the garden is. And I wonder whether you had any idea of what might have constituted an Indian garden, yes, pre-Mughal. And indeed, was there such a thing? Or is it a question of how we look at nature? Do we look at nature in different ways? The British essentially, are they all about controlling things? Is this what imperialism is about? Is it a question of controlling nature? Is that perhaps in conflict with the Indian concept of living in harmony with nature? Or am I romanticizing?
Yes, and we'll
open it for questions in a second.
The point to be made is that the Mughals were doing the same thing. They thought of this as this was civilization, and the sooner the Indians caught on, the better. And of course, there were Mughal gardens or Mughal-inspired gardens all over India before the British. I mean, well, not all over, but down as far as the Deccan. And but Charles asks about pre-Islamic gardens, and that's what's very frustrating. There are many, many references to gardens in the Ramayana, Ravana's garden in Lanka, the plays of Kalidasa, and of course the indispensability of flowers in Indian rituals, religious rituals. So there were plenty of gardens. The Kama Sutra makes a big point, people often don't notice it, that any well-bred person should know how to garden. And they go into rather details about what it meant to be proper gardener. Anyway, we don't know what they looked like. They certainly were grown for scent, so that there would have been lots of jasmines and other plants that are highly scented. But whether, and I'm sure they had some rules of their own. They didn't just let things grow. But we simply don't know what they looked like. And as far as I know, no excavation have turned them up. There are some fairly recent excavations at Tanjore in the south that indicate there was a garden, but it doesn't tell us what it looks like.
I know there's a question here. Was there a question here? Yes. And do please come forward with the questions and we can open it up and have a wider discussion, because I'm sure many of you have strong views on what actually, we've looked essentially, I suppose it's fair saying also that we've looked essentially at what you might call public and state gardens as opposed to private and informal gardens, the private space and the public space. But would you like to ask a question or make a point?
Yes, if I could ask a question, did you look at the residency gardens? Because, for example, I actually went to Indore the other day, and it was written up that Mead, General Sir Richard Mead, he created a very nice garden there, and actually the remnants of it are still evident. And also, presumably in Hyderabad, at the residency, there might have been an interesting garden. Did you look at either of those?
I'm sorry, I didn't. There was too much reverberation. I didn't get that.
So it is very difficult to pick up sound actually in here. But basically, the British residency in Hyderabad has a particularly formalized garden.
Yes.
It's a rather splendid residency. Again, it's very much a state. It's very much a statement, isn't it, about power? But anyway,
well, and there's that there's a lovely illustration of that which William Dalrymple has in his White Mughals, because of course the Hyderabad residency of Kirkpatrick was important in his whole romance.
And I'm sorry, Indore you were talking about. Indore, do you know Indore?
Oh no, I don't
know
Indore.
it so
Sorry,
well, to be honest. I don't know.
About.
Yeah. I think very much the personality of the resident, of course, has a great deal to do with this. I wondered also whether there's anybody, oh, there's a question there.
Yes, thank you. That was lovely. I'm from Bangalore, so I have to say in defense of the Lal Bagh.
I love the Lal Bagh.
I love the Lal Bagh, but they don't always have those ghastly plastic dwarfs there. They're only there during the Republic Day celebrations, I think, at the special flower show. My mother's a horticulturist, an unsung one, and she's looked a great deal also into trying to recreate old Hindu gardens. And I think she came to the conclusion, although she didn't go into an academic research project, but just from thinking about it, that I think in all of the epics, the gardens are referred to as vanas, which means woods. And so I think
not bagh, not bagh.
Bagh. And so, no, or maybe not all. Again, I mean, this is not an academic comment, but her conclusion was that around the temples or around sacred places, you grew the sacred trees, and so you created the sacred gardens just from the woods, and not necessarily from, there was no formality to them.
Yes, so. That sounds very likely, yes. And I think there was also, at least in the Ramayana, there's the contrast between the settled gardens and palace of Ayodhya and the wilderness to which Rama and Sita and Lakshmana are banished. So they certainly had a strong concept of nature versus culture.
I wondered if also, I wonder if anyone could comment also on what fascinates me is one of this, the idea of cross-cultural fertilization. You mentioned the way in which India has colonized large sections of the English garden with the rhododendron. But it's not just, it's the empire striking back, you know. It's one of those phenomena. But it starts much earlier. It is so interesting to realize that so many of the plants, or not so many, but many of the plants that we associate with India have actually come in with the Portuguese, or with, let's say, the China trade, and of course England itself. India has been brightened up by the fruits of empire, and I wondered if that's something you could comment on. Literally the fruits of empire, I might say.
Right, yes.
Or the seeds of empire.
Yes, well it is curious when you think, we were talking before about the cross-fertilization, because not only is England rather impoverished in native species, though you never know it now because of these exchanges. But India, too. Think of the marigold, for instance. You can't imagine India without marigolds. They are not indigenous to India. So, yes, so the whole horticultural landscape has changed with these exchanges. But I think that's true all over the world. There's some wonderful books about the exchange and how the world was remade with these exchanges from the 16th century on, really, from the discoveries. And botanists were, what I find interesting is that the earliest botanies with the East India Company were Scots mostly, and they were trained in Edinburgh as doctors, as surgeons, and Edinburgh was the only medical school in the British Isles that taught botany. So they were among the first to appreciate Indian botanical knowledge and to respect the herbal knowledge, the medicinal knowledge, the knowledge of all these plants in Ayurvedic medicine. Later on, you have a feeling that there was much more scorn on Indian indigenous knowledge, and of course then the huge commercial expansion and attempts at cotton, but also the opium, the tea, all of that just simply overrode the original interest in botany for its own sake.
I think it's very. So if we've got a question there, let's take it from the floor again.
Since there's no one else with a question, I thought I'd throw another one in.
Come on, jump on in, please.
Actually, I just wanted to make a comment. The reason that you have those gardens around the temples, like in Khajuraho, I think are certainly an imperial legacy, but through the Archaeological Survey of India. Yeah. And they are deliberately laid out that way, following some norms that are in probably some dusty book somewhere.
And of course,
I would think it's not so much empire, it's actually the ASI following rules, yes.
This is something I didn't bring up. When you have huge numbers of tourists, these become public parks, not gardens. That is the problem that Kew faced. They wanted to stay strictly botanical garden, or some of the directors did, but the government said, no, these are public parks, you have to take allowance. So you can't have the same sort of garden for an elite group or embassies coming to be entertained as you can for 3 million, 5 million visitors. So yes, so you're caught in a bind. Even if you knew what it looked like, you couldn't really recreate it, practically speaking.
I also, there we are, we've got a question. I wonder if I could just also make a comment about the botanic gardens. I mean, they are one of the great lungs of the great cities now. It's a great joy to me when I go and visit places like the Bangalore Botanic Garden and Calcutta and so on. And the irony, of course, is that they essentially started by the East India Company as a means of discovering how best they can exploit India. Let's see what we can grow here that works, and how can we make some money out of it. And it's one of those indirect blessings, in a way, is it not?
Yes, and some of the superintendents, say, of the Botanical Garden in Calcutta, which was the first and foremost, they were always trying to find ways to satisfy the company, but to satisfy their own more disinterested scientific discoveries. So it was kind of a game.
There was a question over there? Yes. Have we got a mic, or do you want to just jump up and shout?
Yeah, hi, I'll just push on.
There we are. Jump up so we can see you. Yeah.
Hello. Just taking forward what you just mentioned about making money, I have read that in the 18th and 19th centuries, there was a lot of money to be made by selling exotic plants and flowers from the New World in the Old World, so to speak, in England and in Europe and stuff. So I was wondering whether these gardens were actually an economic enterprise to grow exotic flowers from the New World and sell them in UK, or was it just a nice thing to see?
We're having huge sound problems. I'm so sorry.
We're getting so much echo.
I hope you managed to get something out of that. I couldn't quite. This question of economic versus utilitarian or
yeah, basically selling exotic flowers to the homeland, so to speak.
I think it is. I mean, there is this paradox, isn't there? You know, what actually is a garden for? I remember when I was a young teacher in India, our gardener used to go around and, to my horror, he would pluck all the petals, all the flowers off. And to me, as an Englishman, that's rather shocking. But the point was, he was going to make offerings to the temple with the flowers. So which actually is the greater value? You know, it's different attitudes. And of course his attitudes is, and I wondered whether is that, in other words, utilitarian or a value? I think that's the essential question.
Right, well, I think you've answered it.
Yes, we got one over there. I'm really sorry, I find it really difficult.
I think it's clear.
I know that the Durbar Hall was, I think, one way. I think the local Umrao or the Maharaja sat here and he told people, but nobody else could answer back
Told them what to do.
because we can't hear off the floor.
Okay, I wanted to ask you about the Kangra miniatures. The old Kangra miniatures are often depicted with magnificent gardens with swings and arbors and all trees. I'm talking about the Kangra miniatures.
Yes.
The old Kangra miniatures are often
Thank you. I was hoping, yes, because there is the, what you might call the Rajput hill painting tradition, particularly within the Krishna cult, when you see Krishna and Radha disporting themselves in the garden, and they are very much, and again, I'm thinking of Kota. I don't know whether you've been to Kota.
No, I haven't.
And you, again, a real, what's the word, pleasure in vegetation. The artists luxuriating in the wonderful vegetation in the gardens there. And again, that's something we must not ignore. Is that your point?
Yes, and also in some of the old texts, there's references to like the banyan tree as being the home for a village, a lot of sacred flowering trees like the Kadamba tree, where Krishna had his wicked way with all his women, and the Ashoka tree. There's so many, and all these flowers, and they all had meanings, and they all had some kind of philosophy. And it seemed to me that they must have been planted in a way to honour the tradition of these plants. And there must be some kind of illustration somewhere.
And above all, the lotus.
Exactly.
The lotus pond.
Exactly.
Yes. So certainly, one suspects that, as you say, there was all of them devoted to particular deities, and they must have. Of course, some would have been temples to a particular one, so that would have been emphasized. But yes, there was probably some sort of a scheme.
Thank you.
Always, that's much better. You always had the lotus, but the others might very well vary, and especially according to regions, if it was the cult of Shiva or Vishnu or Krishna, who?
I wonder if we could take it down again. It's very difficult. I'm wondering, as an English lad growing up in India, my idea of what I thought of as an Indian garden was essentially an attempt by my parents and others like them, I suppose, to try to recreate a little England. And it didn't work, simply because the hostile climate was not suitable to, particularly I can think of, so many of my friends in India desperately trying to grow roses in a hostile climate. And I do wonder about the logic of that. Have you?
Of course, that was the glory of the hill stations. You could sit up there and grow English flowers and enjoy the cold, wet rain. But also, I just wanted to mention a charming correspondence I had with an Indian woman who was the mother-in-law of a colleague. And she had been enamored, she came from Kerala of all places, and she had become enamored of English gardens through reading Daphne du Maurier and Agatha Christie. And she was a civil servant in Delhi and then finally had a house to retire to in Shimla. And so she had focused always on English plants. So it wasn't just the English trying to get them to grow.
That's true.
She had almost a vicarious nostalgia for them.
And I don't know, all those fascinating pictures you showed me on the structure of the Mughal gardens, and I think I'm right in saying that in Afghanistan, I think they're trying to recreate Baba's garden, are they not? I think you're involved in this project, which again is a classic garden of trying to recreate, or trying to create heaven on earth.
Yes.
The idea of the enclosed paradise, which is a very privileged garden, you might say. It is only for a very privileged few, those who presumably are good enough to go to heaven. And in that sense, it's a very exclusive garden, is it not?
Very exclusive, but then you might say it was comparable to the residency garden for governors and high officials in England, which were certainly not public spaces. Well, we haven't talked about it, but the so-called Mughal gardens of the Rashtrapati Bhavan, that was exclusive use, and that, you can debate it. I don't like the palace, but I do like the gardens because I think that they are an attempt to preserve something of the old. You couldn't possibly have an exact copy. All the plants have changed, for example, since the 17th century. They've been hybridized. But this adapted to the English uses. It's not the chabutra in the middle. It's the patch of lawn for the garden party. But it seems to me that it still keeps some of the excitement of the Mughal garden in an anglicized form.
I'd like to make a point. Also, we have the same problem in the UK, which is the urban district council's garden is rather like the ASI. It's all very highly formalized and hostile, essentially, to the environment. And I wonder whether there's any move in India, if anybody knows of this, to try to recreate what you might go back to the natural garden. There was a move in England that started in Jekyll Hyde, Gertrude Jekyll Hyde and so on, the idea of trying to recreate a natural garden, the garden that Kipling was writing about when he talks about the glory of the garden. The idea is of letting flowers luxuriate, which is essentially not that far removed from the, let's call it the Krishna garden, the celebration of a disorganized, inchoate, free-flowing garden, or very cunningly to appear so. And I wonder whether there's any move in that and whether you have any thoughts on that.
Of course.
Does anybody know of this? Are there any keen gardeners who've tried to recreate what you might call an autochthonous garden, which is free of Mughal formality and indeed English formality, or the idea of trying to control nature? Or I wonder if I'm barking up a tree here, a false tree, the idea of letting nature luxuriate. I'm very conscious, and forgive me, I've been writing about Ashoka, and I'm very conscious that how important yakshis and banjikas play in that, the idea that every tree has a goddess or a spirit in it. Somebody made reference to, if I might say, in Kanpur, one of my ancestors got killed in a duel in 1790, and he was buried outside the cemetery. And now that has become, purely by accident, a little shrine, and there's a little lingam going there, and there's a tree growing there, and the tree is now worshipped, and it's a kind of return to nature, which appeals to me enormously. The idea that one's ancestors are actually fertilizing the ground and continuing the cycle of life. But I'm becoming a little philosophical. We're going to start to wind up, and I do wonder if we've got any more questions from the floor. Yes, we have one over there.
I just wondered if you could suggest a garden that successfully mingled the English and the Mughal influences. If the Taj Mahal really wasn't a Curzon's greatest gardening triumph, is there somewhere we could visit that is?
And I wonder whether you could talk about Lutyens and Baker in New Delhi, the old Viceroy's Lodge, as it was, Rashtrapati Bhavan.
Yes, well, that's what I was mentioning before, that now how much Lutyens himself didn't know one plant from another. It was really his collaboration with Gertrude Jekyll that gave him some sense. And she always emphasized there had to be water. So that was a point of congruence with the Mughal gardens. But what was the question?
I just wondered whether you've had a look at it and because it's a hugely formal. I mean, the architecture is power and strength and authority of the Raj.
But
what about the garden?
Yes, I had the good fortune to see it last March when it was at its height, and we had a private viewing so we could meander around. Of course, it's all English spring flowers, which is why it's only open for a little bit in February and March. And you wonder how a monsoon garden would have looked, and it would have looked totally different. And it is the problem. I mean, what is the Archaeological Survey of India going to do? Is it going to plant or plant a garden that will, or lawns that will at least look decent when the tourists are all there in the winter? Or is it going to do some, foreign tourists, is it going to do something that would be a monsoon garden? The glory of the monsoon garden would be that it would restore some of the scents, I think. And you don't smell anything at the Taj Mahal. It's very sad, and you don't hear much the way of birds either.
I don't know whether Eugenia has been here when the monsoons come, and that moment when the first rains come and the perfume that is released from the ground, the earth itself as well as the flowers, is one of the, India is reborn, something that I find very
Yes.
hugely emotive
Yes.
and
Yes.
striking. We'll close now, but Eugenia will be signing some books. If you want to continue the discussion, please feel free to do so. I thank you for your patience in these difficult circumstances, and in particular, Eugenia, Herbert, thank you very much
And
indeed.
thank you all for coming.
patience. Thank you. Well done.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Eugenia. Thank you.